And thanks for staying with us on Morning Live. Now, the Department of Co-operative Governance and Traditional Affairs in KwaZulu-Natal has refuted claims of a missing 220 million rand that was meant for drought relief. And due to the effects of the lack of rain, the province now has to consider water restrictions and other intervention measures. MEC in the portfolio, Nomusa Dube-Ncube, says that 122 million rand has been allocated from the National Disaster Management to help areas that are mostly affected. And to discuss this further, we're joined by Lennox Mabaso, who's a spokesperson of COGTA in KwaZulu-Natal. Mr. Mabaso, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
Let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about this 220 million rand that has purportedly gone missing from your coffers. So is that correct?
Well, we want to state it categorically and unequivocally clear, Sakina, that it is actually fallacious. It is not true. It is a misrepresentation of what transpired at the media briefing that the MEC for COGTA, MEC Nomusa Dube-Ncube, had convened to apprise the citizens of this province about the phenomenon of a green drought that we are currently experiencing. Indeed, we want to be very clear that in this province we frown upon corruption. The Premier and the provincial government, they frown upon corruption and they will act decisively. There is no money that was intended for drought that was misappropriated. This province is a model in terms of how to deal with the phenomenon and the challenge of a disaster like a drought. Every province that experienced drought after KZN were taking lessons from what we've done here in order to ensure that we mitigate the impact of the drought. So the story of the 220 million rand that went missing is false and it's untrue, and I think it's was a misrepresentation, a conflation of an issue that was happening in another department where there is also an investigation, but it got conflated to the issue that we're dealing with, which relates to the phenomenon of the green drought.
So explain to us what exactly happened with that 220 million, because if you're saying the story is fallacious, then it means the department can actually show the evidence of how that money was spent.
Okay, this is how it happened. I will just sketch a brief picture. When there's a disaster like drought, the Department of COGTA under MEC Nomusa Dube-Ncube will conduct an analysis, and after detailing an analysis, it will then brief the provincial government and say, look, the impact of the drought on agriculture is as big as this. The impact on water for human consumption is as big as this. The magnitude of the impact of the drought on environment, game reserves, and so forth, on hospitals, on clinics. They will then compile the report and then we will say the cost will be over 1.3 billion rand. And this is what we did, and the cost were over 1.3 billion rand in terms of the impact of the drought. We then, the province declared the disaster area through the Premier, Honorable Wilson Mkhunu. We declared the disaster area and the cabinet, and it went up to national government, and national government made available some resources through various departments. But what will happen is that if there is money to assist the farmers, commercial and subsistence, that money doesn't come to COGTA. It goes to the Department of Agriculture. For schools, it will go to the Education Department. For health, it will go to the Department of Health, and so forth and so forth. So eventually what COGTA will do, will perform an oversight to make sure that where our report reveals that there is a highest impact of the drought, monies are spent there. For water, for human consumption, money will go to the Department of Water and Sanitation. It will transfer it directly to municipalities. So what then happened is that there was a media briefing convened by our sister Department of Agriculture last year, where they said they were launching an investigation into some parts of the allocation that went to the Department of Agriculture, and that matter is a subject of an SIU investigation. But to conclude even on that one and say it's 220 million is fallacious, is false, because the investigation is still ongoing, and the report will then say how much of that was misspent. But it's just a sectoral issue. It's not a matter that is of a problem as it has been pictured, analyzed and pictured by other people to say that the province has got about 220 million that went missing, and there's got there's been no
equally
action.
By your own explanation, you cannot therefore then say that the amount is fallacious, because you also do not know.
Well, we do know that there's an investigation because there are allegations, but to conclude and say it's 220 million, again, is a misrepresentation. There's no big amount of money like that was misappropriated. I think and we're dealing with a portion here of a bigger sum of over 1 billion rand. So there was just a question mark on an allocation that had gone to the Agriculture Department. And this very same government, the MEC for Agriculture, is the one that convened a press briefing and say, I am investigating. Because remember, whenever allegations are raised, the government will act speedily to make sure that those who are behind any wrongdoing are dealt with. So there's an investigation by this very same government, but instead of government being applauded for taking action, we then have a situation where this whole issue is completely misrepresented and is completely conflated. So it is not the whole sum of 220, but the investigation, we cannot preempt it. Let it conclude from the SIU, which the Premier requested to investigate, and it will uncover. But to conclude and say it's the entire 20 million that was allocated to the agricultural sector, again, I think it's being premature in terms of jumping to conclusion before we get a full report.
So just to bottom line this before we move on to other matters, are you therefore agreeing that some of this money was misspent? If not the entire 220 million, some of it may have gone missing?
The only part that we agree on is that there are allegations that were raised, and those allegations are being investigated by this very same provincial government, and it has acted and called a competent institution such as the SIU to investigate. So let us await that report to tell us. But let us also understand that we responded in the drought situation in a manner that set an example in the entire country. And to also say the allocation to various sectors were more than 220 million. But it's just a portion that is being investigated. Again, it's not correct to say it's the entire 220 million. The investigation will tell us how much of that 220 that was communicated by our MEC for Agriculture and his department actually went in missing. And already we understand there are people, I think over 21, that have already been suspended as a result of that action. So there's some work that is currently being dealt with to ensure which all that money was spent in terms of the project that they were earmarked for. But let's await the full report.
All right, we're running out of time. 2 questions. Number 1, when can we expect that final report in this regard? And number 2, with regard to the water restrictions currently in place, what interventions have you put in place to alleviate these restriction problems?
Well, I'm sure the Honorable Premier has never let down the people of South Africa and KwaZulu-Natal. When the report is ready, it will be made available like we did with all the other reports. The MEC for Agriculture will also do the same. In terms of your other question relating to the green drought, because, the story unfortunately confused a very important message. What is happening here is that we have a phenomenon where, for instance, we've got some of the areas that are bone dry in terms of receiving rains, that the other parts of the strips of the province are receiving rains. So in some areas we are already experiencing people running out of water as urgent interventions are being required. So we call that phenomenon a green drought because the rains that are being received to an extent are not going to the groundwater to replenish some of the rivers and some of the streams that are dry. So people are beginning to battle. So the province has put interventions in place. It was an early warning system to say to people, we are approaching dry months, which are hydrological months from May. And if the situation doesn't improve, we're going to be back to what we were, in 2015 when the drought started. To warn people that we are beginning to, in some areas, to apply water restrictions and the other mechanism to conserve water, and to say to people, start conserving water because we are heading for another disaster if the situation doesn't improve in the next 2 to 3 months.
Mr. Lennox Mabaso, thanks so much for your time this morning. COGTA spokesperson in KwaZulu-Natal. We're going to go to a break. When we come back, we'll talk about positive parenting.